Grace Parker was standing in the middle of her own living room, the one with the cream-colored couch she had saved for 2 years to buy, when her husband said the words that would split her life into a before and an after. "Either our son leaves this house today," Joel Parker said, his voice flat and final, like a man reading a verdict he had already made peace with, "or both of you do." The afternoon light was coming through the front window in long gold bars, catching the dust in the air, catching the side of Joel's face so that Grace could see he wasn't joking, wasn't bluffing, wasn't even angry in the way people are angry when they still love each other underneath it. He was calm. That was the part that would stay with her for 20 years. He was completely, terrifyingly calm. Behind her, in the hallway that led to his bedroom, 7-year-old Noah was rocking gently on his heels, his hands pressed flat against his ears, humming the 4 notes of a song from a cartoon he loved because the sameness of it made the world feel less loud. He didn't understand what his father had just said. Grace understood every word of it, and she would spend the rest of her life understanding what it cost her to answer. What did Grace choose? Stay with us, because before you find out what she said in that living room, you need to know what led her there, and what it built in the years after. 3 years earlier, Grace Parker had been the kind of mother who narrated the whole world to her son, not because a book told her to, but because watching Noah's face light up at the sound of her voice was the closest thing to church she had ever known. "That's a dog, Noah. That's a big blue truck. That's Mommy's favorite song." He didn't always answer back, not with words, not at first, but he would reach for her hand and press it against his cheek, and Grace decided that was its own kind of language, one she intended to learn fluently. Joel had wanted a son who would inherit the business. Parker Realty Group had his father's name on the door and his grandfather's ambition running through it like a second bloodline, and Joel had pictured a boy who'd sit in the back seat of open houses, who'd shake hands with senators at the country club, who'd grow into cufflinks and confidence the way Joel himself had. When Noah was born, Joel held him for exactly 4 minutes in the hospital before handing him back to Grace, and some part of her, some quiet, frightened part, noticed that and filed it away without knowing yet what would come to mean. The diagnosis came when Noah was 2.5. Dr. Amara Osei sat across from them in an office that smelled like hand sanitizer and old carpet, and she used the word autism carefully, the way you'd hand someone something breakable. Grace remembered gripping Joel's hand so hard her knuckles went white, waiting for him to squeeze back. He didn't. He sat with his jaw tight and his eyes fixed on a spot on the wall just past the doctor's shoulder, and when they got in the car afterward he said only one sentence, "We don't tell my parents yet." Naughty, how do we help him? Naughty, what does he need? Just an instruction about who was allowed to know. Grace threw herself into learning everything. She read about sensory processing until the words started to feel like her own native tongue. She found an occupational therapist named Priya who taught her how to build a calm corner in Noah's room with weighted blankets and dim lighting, how noise-cancelling headphones weren't a crutch but a lifeline, how a meltdown wasn't defiance, it was a nervous system in a flood it couldn't swim out of. She learned to read Noah's hands, the way his fingers would flutter before he got overwhelmed, like a bird testing the wind before a storm. She became fluent in her son in a way she had never been fluent in anything. Not college, not her old job in marketing, not even her own marriage. Joel became fluent in something else, avoidance. He started staying later at the office. He stopped inviting his business partners over for dinner. When Noah lined up his toy cars in a long, perfect row across the living room floor, arranging them by color with a concentration that made Grace's heart swell with pride, Joel would step over them without a word, as if they were an inconvenience left by someone else's child. "He's brilliant, Joel," Grace told him one night, after Noah had spent 40 minutes explaining the entire water cycle to her in more detail than she'd learned in her own 4th grade class. "Do you understand what that mind of his is doing?" "I understand that my partners ask why my son doesn't look them in the eye," Joel said, not looking up from his phone. "I understand that Bill Harmon's kid is starting Little League and mine still wears headphones to his own birthday party," He wears them because the noise hurts him, not because he's broken. I didn't say broken. Joel finally looked at her, and there was something almost like an apology in his face for half a second before it hardened again. I said different. And different doesn't close deals. That was the year Joel stopped bringing Noah to open houses, stopped mentioning him at the holiday party, started introducing him, on the rare occasions he couldn't avoid it, as our youngest without a name attached, like Noah was a fact to be minimized rather than a person to be known. Grace watched her husband build a wall brick by brick, and she kept trying to hand him windows. When Noah was 5, he had a meltdown at Joel's company picnic. A drum line had shown up as surprise entertainment, and the sound hit Noah like a physical blow. He dropped to the grass, hands over his ears, rocking and crying in front of 40 of Joel's colleagues. Grace was at his side in half a second, wrapping her arms around him, shielding his ears with her own hands, murmuring the countdown she'd taught him, 10, 9, 8, that helped him find his way back to solid ground. When she looked up, Joel was 20 feet away, talking to a client, his back turned, his shoulders rigid with something that looked less like worry and more like humiliation. He didn't come to check on his son until the picnic was over. That night, in the car, Joel said, "We can't do that again." "Do what?" Grace said, exhausted, her arms still trembling from holding Noah through it. "Have a nervous system?" Joel, he's 5. I mean in public. People were staring. People were staring at a little boy having a hard moment, and if any of them judged him for that, they can go straight to hell. Grace didn't often curse. She meant it that night. Joel didn't answer. He just drove, both hands on the wheel, eyes on the road, already somewhere else. By the time Noah was 7, the marriage had become a slow leak Grace kept trying to patch. She took on part-time bookkeeping work so she could afford the therapies insurance wouldn't cover. She learned to stretch a grocery budget into meals that still felt like love. She kept Noah's world soft at the edges, predictable schedules, familiar textures, a mother's voice always steady even when her own hands shook with exhaustion at 11 at night, folding laundry after Noah was finally asleep, wondering how much longer she could hold both her son and her marriage in the same 2 arms. It was during a stretch of especially cruel bad luck, a downturn in the housing market, 2 deals falling through in the same month, a business partner threatening to pull out, that Joel's frustration curdled into something colder. He started coming home smelling faintly of whiskey on weeknights. He started snapping at Noah for things that weren't within Noah's control, the way he needed his sandwich cut in triangles, not squares, the way loud chewing at the table sent him rocking, the way he asked the same question about dinosaurs 11 times in 11 different ways because the asking itself, the ritual of it, was what soothed him. "He does this on purpose," Joel said once, low and bitter, after Noah had a meltdown over a change in the dinner plan. "He's punishing me." "He's 7, Joel. He's not capable of that kind of cruelty. You are watching a boy who is scared and confused, and instead of helping him, you're standing there deciding he's your enemy." "I'm deciding," Joel said, "that I didn't sign up for this." Grace never forgot that sentence. Didn't sign up for this. As if fatherhood came with a return policy. As if love had fine print. The ultimatum came on a Tuesday in October, 3 weeks after that fight, and it came out of nowhere and also out of everywhere, the way a dam doesn't break so much as it finally admits it had been cracking the whole time. Joel had just gotten off the phone with his father, who'd asked, not for the first time, why Noah never came to Sunday dinners anymore. Joel had made an excuse. His father had pushed. And something in Joel had snapped loose. He walked into the living room where Grace was helping Noah build a Lego castle, Noah's hands moving with careful, joyful precision, lining up each brick by color the way he lined up everything that mattered to him, and Joel said the words that would end one chapter of Grace Parker's life and begin another. "Either our son leaves this house today, or both of you do." Grace stood up slowly. She looked at her husband, really looked at him, at the man she had married in a church with peonies on every pew, the man who had once cried at their wedding, who had once, just once, held Noah for 4 whole minutes and looked, for a moment, like he might learn to love what he didn't understand, and she felt something in her chest go quiet and clear, like a held breath finally released. "Say it again," she said. "Say it so I know I heard you." Joel's jaw tightened. "You heard me." Behind her, Noah had stopped building. He was rocking now, humming those same 4 notes, his small hands pressed to his ears, because even without understanding the words, he understood the temperature of the room, the way children like Noah so often do, reading feeling where language fails them. Grace crossed the room, knelt down, and pulled Noah gently against her chest, feeling his heartbeat hammering too fast beneath his ribs. She stroked his hair the way that calmed him, counting softly against his ear, 10, 9, 8, and only once his breathing slowed did she stand back up and look at her husband with a steadiness that surprised even her. "Then we both go," she said. "And you should know, Joel, you didn't just lose a wife today. You lost the only 2 people in this house who ever loved you without a single condition attached." She packed 2 suitcases that night. She didn't cry until she was in the car, Noah buckled safely in the back seat, humming himself to sleep to a song only he could hear, and Grace gripped the steering wheel in a Motel 6 parking lot and let herself sob, silently, so as not to wake him, for exactly 6 minutes. Then she wiped her face, checked her mirrors, and drove. If you've ever had to choose between the love that's easy and the love that's true, you already know what Grace was carrying that night. We'll be back in just a moment, but first, if this story is already sitting somewhere in your chest, hit subscribe, because Grace and Noah's journey is only beginning, and I promise you, it gets harder before it gets beautiful. The first year was the hardest year, and Grace would say that for the rest of her life, even after harder years came. They moved into a 1-bedroom apartment above a laundromat on the wrong side of town, the kind of place where the radiator clanked all night and the neighbors fought in a language Grace didn't recognize but understood perfectly anyway. She took the bedroom apart at the seams to build Noah his calm corner first, before she even unpacked her own boxes, the weighted blanket, the dim lamp, the noise-cancelling headphones that were fraying at the seams because she couldn't yet afford new ones. She slept on the pull-out couch in the front room, and some nights the springs dug into her back so badly she'd lie awake doing math in her head. Bookkeeping job. Weekend shifts at a diner. Occasional babysitting for a family 2 floors down. It was never quite enough, and it was always, somehow, exactly enough, because Grace had decided in that living room the night Joel gave his ultimatum, that enough was not a number. It was a choice she made every single morning when she opened her eyes and heard Noah's small voice already narrating his day to himself in the next room. Joel sent money, at first, inconsistent, grudging, always a little late, always accompanied by a text that felt more like an accusation than support. Asterisk, this is the last time I can do this month. Asterisk, you knew what you were signing up for when you left. Asterisk, Grace stopped expecting it eventually, which turned out to be its own strange relief. Expecting nothing meant she could stop being disappointed by nothing. Noah struggled that first year in ways that broke Grace's heart open fresh every week. He started at a new school where the other second graders hadn't grown up around him, hadn't learned, the way his old classmates slowly had, that Noah's silences weren't rudeness and his hand flapping when he was excited wasn't strange, just Noah being happy in the language his body spoke. A boy named Tyler started calling him a robot in the hallway, mimicking the way Noah sometimes repeated phrases from his favorite shows when he was nervous. Noah came home one day with his shirt untucked and a scrape on his elbow he wouldn't explain, and when Grace finally coaxed it out of him, gently, patiently, over the course of an hour, because Noah needed time to find words for things that hurt, she learned that Tyler and 2 other boys had shoved him into a locker to see if he'd short-circuit. Grace went to the school the next morning. She sat across from a principal who kept using phrases like "a boys will be boys" and a helping Noah develop thicker skin, and something in her, the same something that had stood up straight in that living room a year before, refused to shrink. "My son does not need thicker skin," as she said, her voice low and even. "The other children need thinner cruelty. There's a difference, and it's your job to teach it, not his job to survive it." She didn't get an apology that day. But she got a new aide assigned to Noah's classroom within the month, and she filed it away as one small, hard-won victory in a war she hadn't asked to be drafted into. It was around that time, Noah newly 8, Grace stretched thinner than she thought a person could be stretched and still function, that Eleanor Carter came into their lives. Eleanor lived 2 doors down in the apartment building, a retired special education teacher in her early 70s with silver hair always pinned back in a neat twist and the kind of patient, unhurried presence that made rooms feel calmer just by her being in them. She'd taught for 31 years in the public school system, the last 15 in a classroom built specifically for kids whose minds worked differently than the curriculum assumed they should. She noticed Noah before she ever spoke to him. Noticed the way he arranged the mail slots by color when he collected packages for the building, noticed the careful, focused way he watched the world, cataloging it. One afternoon, Grace came home from a double shift to find Eleanor sitting on the stairwell landing with Noah, both of them bent over a worn deck of cards, Eleanor patiently teaching him a matching game while explaining, in a calm and steady voice, why each pattern worked the way it did. Grace nearly wept on the spot, not from worry, but from the simple, overwhelming relief of watching someone else see her son the way she saw him. His remarkable, Eleanor told her later, over tea in Grace's cramped kitchen, once Noah had gone to bed. That mind of his doesn't miss anything. Do you know he corrected me twice today on the sequence of a card pattern I've been teaching for 30 years? He was right both times. I know he's smart, Grace said. I just don't always know what to do with it. I'm so tired, Eleanor. I love him more than my own life, and some days I don't know if love is enough to get him where he needs to go. Eleanor reached across the table and took Grace's hand, the same steady, unhurried grip she must have used to calm 1,000 overwhelmed children over 3 decades. Love isn't the finish line, honey. It's the ground he stands on while he learns to run the race himself. You've given him that ground. Let me help you build the track. And so began the years that would change everything. Eleanor started tutoring Noah 3 afternoons a week, for free, because she said retirement had made her restless and she'd rather spend it on someone worth the trouble. She discovered quickly that Noah's mind moved in patterns. He understood the world through systems, sequences, structures, and once he had those, he could build almost anything on top of them. He struggled with the unpredictable social choreography of a lunchroom but could recite, without error, the order of every U.S. president alongside the years they served. He couldn't always meet someone's eyes, but he could look at a page of dense legal text. Eleanor had once brought over an old civics textbook just to test something, and retain the structure of it after a single read. He thinks like a lawyer, Eleanor told Grace one evening, half joking, half serious, watching 8-year-old Noah methodically explain to her exactly why a card game's rules were internally inconsistent, complete with a proposed fix. He wants fairness. He wants rules that make sense and apply equally. You watch, Grace. That boy has got justice wired into him at the root. Grace laughed through unexpected tears that night. She didn't know yet how true it would turn out to be. She just knew, for the first time in a long while, that someone else believed in her son's future as fiercely as she did, and that belief felt like being handed a second pair of hands after years of trying to carry the world alone. The years that followed were not a montage of easy triumphs. Grace wanted to be honest with herself about that, always. There were setbacks, a middle school transition that undid months of social progress, a summer where Noah refused to leave his room for 11 straight days after a class field trip went sensory catastrophically wrong, A stretch in ninth grade where his grade slipped because a new teacher refused to provide the accommodations his IEP required and Grace had to fight. Again, the same fight she'd fought with that first principal. Learning the particular exhaustion of proving, over and over, that her son deserved a fair chance rather than a diagnosis-shaped excuse to be dismissed. But there was also this. Noah joined the debate team in 10th grade, at Eleanor's gentle insistence, terrified of the unstructured social stakes of it but drawn, unstoppably, to the clean architecture of an argument, premise, evidence, conclusion, a kind of fairness he could actually hold on to. He was awkward at first, his speech patterns a little too formal, his eye contact still a work in progress. His coach, a sharp young woman named Ms. Alvarez, nearly cut him from the team after his first disastrous round. Eleanor talked her out of it. "Give him one more round," she said. "You're watching a diamond that hasn't found its facets yet. Don't throw him out because he doesn't sparkle the way you expected." By his junior year, Noah Parker was the best debater in the district. He didn't win because he was the most polished, he won because when he built an argument, it didn't have a single loose board in it. Opponents who tried to rattle him with quick emotional appeals found that Noah simply returned, calm and unbothered, to the facts, to the structure, to what was actually true, and that unshakable steadiness became, ironically, the very thing that made him formidable. Grace sat in the back of every tournament she could get time off work to attend, and she watched her son, the boy who once couldn't bear a drum line at a company picnic, stand at a podium in front of 200 strangers and dismantle an argument with nothing but patience and precision, and she thought, not for the first time, that the world had never deserved to almost lose him. He got into college on a partial scholarship, supplemented by grants Grace spent an entire summer researching and applying for on his behalf, staying up past midnight after her shifts filling out forms by the light of a laptop that was 2 years past its warranty. Noah studied political science and philosophy as an undergraduate, then went on to law school, where his particular mind, patent-seeking, exhaustive, relentlessly fair, found, for the first time in his life, an environment built almost entirely to reward the way he thought rather than punish him for it. He specialized, eventually, in civil rights and constitutional law, and though Grace never asked him directly why, she suspected she already knew. A boy who had spent his childhood being told, implicitly and explicitly, that he didn't fit the shape the world expected, grows up understanding, in his bones, what it means when systems fail people simply for being different. Noah built a career out of making sure they didn't get away with it. By the time Noah Parker was 30, he was one of the most respected civil rights attorneys in the country, not famous in the tabloid sense, but known, deeply known, in the rooms that mattered. Judges respected him because he never overstated a case. Opposing counsel feared him because he never needed to raise his voice. He simply laid out the truth so cleanly that theatrics became irrelevant. Eleanor, well into her 90s by then, kept a newspaper clipping about one of his cases pinned to her refrigerator until the day she passed, peacefully, with Grace and Noah both at her bedside, the woman who had seen a diamond in a stairwell and had refused to let anyone tell her she was wrong. Meanwhile, Joel Parker's life had followed an entirely different trajectory. For a while, in the years right after Grace left, his business had actually flourished, or seemed to. Parker Realty Group expanded aggressively, buying up commercial properties across 3 counties, and Joel became the kind of man who got quoted in the Regional Business Journal, who golfed with the mayor, who married again within 2 years to a woman named Deborah who liked being seen beside him more than she ever seemed to like him. He told people, when Noah came up at all, that his son from a previous marriage he had some challenges and left it there, a sentence with the truth surgically removed from it. But the empire Joel built had been built on sand, and sand, eventually, shifts. He had been cutting corners for years, inflating property valuations to secure larger loans, falsifying inspection reports to close deals faster, quietly diverting client escrow funds to cover shortfalls when the market dipped. Each individual decision had felt, to Joel, like a temporary fix, A bridge loan against his own conscience that he fully intended to pay back once the next big deal came through. But there is no such thing as temporary dishonesty. It compounds, the way debt compounds, until one day the bridge collapses under weight it was never built to hold. The collapse, when it came, was fast and total. A disgruntled former employee tipped off state regulators. A federal investigation followed within the year, uncovering a pattern of fraud that stretched back over a decade. Joel's business partners, men who had shaken his hand at 100 closings, who had toasted him at galas, distanced themselves so quickly it was as if they'd rehearsed it. Deborah filed for divorce 3 weeks after the first news story broke, taking with her the house, the cars, and what remained of Joel's public dignity. His own father, in his 80s by then and still sharp enough to be disappointed, told Joel over the phone that he was ashamed to share a name with him, the same father whose approval Joel had spent a lifetime chasing at the cost of everything that actually mattered. Joel's lawyer of 18 years dropped him 2 months before trial, citing conflicts that everyone understood were really about reputation. A second attorney lasted 6 weeks. A third refused to even take the meeting. Joel sat alone in a rented condo that smelled like other people's cigarettes, facing federal wire fraud charges that carried the real possibility of prison, and for the first time in his adult life, he had absolutely no one left to call. It was an old golfing acquaintance, oddly enough, who mentioned the name almost in passing over a drink Joel could no longer really afford. "You need someone who can actually win an unwinnable case," the man said. "There's an attorney in the city, does mostly civil rights work, but I've heard he takes on white-collar cases when he believes there's a genuine due process issue. Sharpest legal mind I've encountered in 20 years of business. Parker, I think his name is. Noah Parker." Joel didn't make the connection. Parker was a common enough name, and it had been over 2 decades. The idea simply didn't occur to him, because in Joel's mind, the son he'd cast out of his living room on a Tuesday afternoon had never been allowed to grow into someone capable of anything at all. He'd stopped imagining Noah's life the moment he stopped being part of it. That was its own kind of tragedy, separate from all the others. A father who had spent 20 years assuming his son's story had simply stopped, when in fact it had only just begun. Joel called the office the next morning, secured an emergency consultation through sheer desperation and the last of his fading charm, and drove across town to a glass office building downtown, rehearsing, the whole way, the version of his story he intended to tell, the version where he was a good man caught in bad circumstances, where the fraud was really just aggressive business practice misunderstood by regulators who'd never built anything themselves. He walked into the waiting room, straightened his tie out of old habit, and was led down a hallway toward a corner office with a view of the river. He did not recognize the man behind the desk. 20 years does that. It reshapes a boy's face into something new, adds height and breadth and the particular gravity that comes from having survived things. Joel saw a composed man in his early 30s, sharp grey suit, a face that seemed, for one disorienting instant, distantly, structurally familiar in a way Joel couldn't place, like a word on the tip of his tongue. "Mr. Parker," the attorney said, standing, extending a hand. "Please, sit down." Joel Saturday. He began his rehearsed speech, the story of a man wronged by an overzealous federal investigation, and the attorney listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable, his eyes steady in a way that made Joel, a man who had spent his whole life reading rooms for advantage, feel strangely, unaccountably exposed, the way you feel when someone is not just hearing your words but weighing them against something else entirely. When Joel finished, the attorney was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached for a pen on his desk and, with a small, careful, deeply familiar motion, aligned it perfectly parallel to the edge of a legal pad in front of him, squared it, adjusted it a fraction of an inch, until it sat exactly, precisely straight. Joel felt something cold move through his chest before his mind had even caught up to why. He had seen that exact motion before. 1,000 times before. A small boy at a kitchen table, lining up crowns by color with total, absorbed concentration, while his father sighed from across the room and said, "Not for the first time. Asterisk, why does he have to do that? Asterisk." "Say your name again," Joel said, his voice suddenly unsteady. "Your full name." The attorney set the pen down and looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time since Joel had walked in, and something in his composed, careful face shifted, just slightly, into something older and rawer and far more complicated than professional distance. "Noah Parker," he said quietly. "Grace Parker's son." The silence that followed was long enough that Joel could hear the building's ventilation system, could hear his own heartbeat pushing blood too fast through his ears. He stared at this stranger who was not a stranger, searching his face for the boy he'd once stepped over on his way through a living room, and finding him there, unmistakably, in the steady grey eyes, in the careful hands, in the particular quiet dignity that Grace had built into him one exhausted, determined day at a time. "Noah," Joel said, and his voice cracked on the single syllable in a way it hadn't cracked in decades. "My God. Noah." "Yes," Noah said. He did not stand up. He did not offer a warmer greeting than the situation could bear. "You're facing federal wire fraud charges, along with several counts of falsifying financial records. You came here for the best defense attorney you could find." He paused, and something flickered behind his composed expression. Not cruelty, Joel would realize later, but a very old, very carefully guarded grief. "You didn't know it would be me." "I didn't," Joel admitted. His hands were shaking now, and he pressed them flat against his knees, an old habit from a lifetime of trying to look like a man in control. "Noah, I don't even know where to begin. I don't have the right to ask you for anything. I know that." "No," Noah agreed evenly. "You don't." The word landed in the room like a verdict of its own, and for a moment Joel thought that was the end of it, that the interview was over, that he would be shown the door and left to face the collapse of everything he'd built entirely alone, which was, some old and honest part of him understood, no less than what he deserved. But Noah didn't ask him to leave. Instead, he opened a drawer, took out a fresh legal pad, and set it precisely square in front of himself. "I'm going to ask you a question," he said, "and I need you to understand that my answer to what happens next depends entirely on how honestly you answer it. Not because I'm trying to trap you. Because I built my entire career on a simple rule, and I'm not going to break it for you just because we share a name." He looked up. "Did you actually commit the fraud you're being investigated for?" Joel's first instinct, 20 years of instinct, a lifetime of protecting the image over the truth, was to deny it, to soften it, to explain it into something smaller than it was. He opened his mouth to do exactly that. And then he looked at his son's face, at the steady, unflinching patience there, the same patience Grace used to have when she was waiting for the truth to surface in someone who was frightened to give it, and something in Joel simply broke open. "Yes," he said. "Yes, I did it. I inflated valuations. I falsified inspection records. I moved money I shouldn't have touched. I told myself every single time it was temporary, that I'd fix it before anyone noticed, and I never did, and eventually there was too much of it to fix it all." His voice was unsteady, raw in a way that surprised even him. "I'm not a good man, Noah. I don't think I have been for a very long time. I think I stopped being one the day I told your mother to choose between you and me, and I think everything since then has just been the slow proof of that." Noah didn't say anything for a long moment. He looked down at the legal pad, at the pen he'd so carefully aligned, and Joel watched his son's jaw tighten the exact way his own used to, an inheritance neither of them had asked for. "I'm not going to make this disappear," Noah finally said. "You committed fraud. There are victims, people who lost money, lost homes, Lost trust in a system that's already too easy to exploit. I've spent my entire career making sure people like that get a fair accounting. I'm not going to abandon that principle because the man on trial happens to be my father. He paused. But everyone, including you, deserves a fair trial. Deserves competent counsel who will make sure the process itself is honest, even when the man at the center of it wasn't. I can give you that. I won't give you anything more than that. That's more than I have any right to, Joel said, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he meant something completely, without a single calculation running underneath it. There's one more condition, Anoa said. Anything. You'll see my mother. Not to ask for anything from her. She doesn't owe you an audience, and if she refuses, that's the end of it. I won't push her. But if she's willing, you're going to sit across from her and you're going to tell her the truth about who you've been for 20 years, without excuses, without softening it. Whatever she decides to do with that truth is her business, not yours, and not mine. Joel nodded, and for the first time in the meeting, tears he didn't try to hide slid down his face. Yes, he said. Yes. Whatever she'll allow. Grace agreed to see him 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday afternoon, which she noted to herself with a small, tired irony was the same day of the week Joel had once stood in her living room and asked her to choose. She met him in a quiet cafe near Noah's office, chosen deliberately, she'd tell him later, because it was public enough that neither of them would raise their voices, and private enough that she could leave the moment she needed to. Joel looked older than his years. The collapse had aged him in ways money never had to compensate for. He stood when she walked in, an old habit of manners neither of them mentioned, and waited until she sat before he did. I don't expect forgiveness, he said, before she'd even taken off her coat. I want to say that first, because I think if I don't say it first I'll spend this whole conversation angling for it without meaning to. I've spent my whole life angling for things. I don't want to do that to you. Not today. Grace studied him for a long moment, this man who had once been the center of her whole young life, who had cried at their wedding and held their son for 4 minutes and then spent 20 years making both of those moments feel like accidents rather than choices. You gave me an ultimatum in my own living room, she said, quietly, evenly, and you have no idea, Joel, what those 20 years actually cost. Not the money. I stopped grieving the money a long time ago. I mean the nights I sat on the floor of a 1-bedroom apartment doing math I couldn't make work, wondering if I was failing him. I mean the years I was so tired I forgot what my own voice sounded like when it wasn't calming someone else down. I mean watching my son get shoved into a locker by a boy who called him a robot, and going home that night and crying in the shower so he wouldn't hear me, because he needed me steady, and I gave him steady even when I had nothing left underneath it. Joel's hands were folded tightly on the table, his knuckles pale. I know, he said. I know I don't get to say I know, because I wasn't there to know it firsthand. But I've had 20 years to imagine it, and every version I imagined was probably kinder than what actually happened. It was, Grace said simply. They sat in silence for a while. The cafe hummed around them, a milk steamer, a door chime, someone laughing 2 tables over about something that had nothing to do with either of them. I'm not going to tell you it's all right, Grace said eventually. Because it isn't, and I don't believe in telling comfortable lies just to end an uncomfortable conversation faster. But I will tell you this, because I think it matters more than whatever apology you came here to give. She leaned forward slightly. Noah became the man he is in spite of you, Joel. Not because of some story where hardship built character. I don't believe suffering is a gift, and I never want you to tell yourself that what you did to him served some purpose. It didn't. He became who he is because of Eleanor Carter, who saw him on a stairwell and refused to look away. He became who he is because of every teacher who fought for him and everyone who didn't and taught him, the hard way, what unfairness looked like, so he'd spend his whole life fighting it in other people's lives too. And he became who he is because I decided, the day you gave me that ultimatum, that I would rather be poor and whole than comfortable and complicit in you shrinking him 1 inch at a time. Her voice, which had stayed remarkably level through all of it, finally caught, just slightly, on the next sentence. You didn't get to watch him grow up, Joel. That's not a punishment I designed. That's simply the shape of the choice you made. And it's the truest, saddest thing I know. You lost the best thing that ever happened to either of us, and you lost it by your own hand, on a Tuesday afternoon, over nothing more than what other people might think. Joel didn't try to argue with her. He sat with it, really sat with it, in a way Grace hadn't expected him capable of, 20 years ago, and when he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse. Is there anything, he asked, that I could do now, at this point, that would mean anything at all? Not to erase it. I know it can't be erased. Just mean something. Grace considered the question honestly, because she owed him honesty even if she owed him nothing else. Show up, as she finally said. Not for me. For the process. Take responsibility in that courtroom the way you're taking it at this table, without the excuses you've probably been rehearsing for years. Let Noah do his job with integrity instead of asking him to bend it for you. And if there's ever a day he decides he wants you in whatever's left of his life, let that be entirely his choice, on his terms, in his time. Don't make it about what you need. You've made everything about what you needed for 40 years. See if you can go one stretch of your life without doing that. Joel nodded slowly, and something in his posture, the practiced ease of a man who had spent his whole career reading a room to his own advantage, seemed to finally, quietly, surrender. The trial, when it came, was not the redemption arc Joel might once have hoped for, back when he still believed charm and confidence could out-argue the truth. Noah represented him with total professional integrity, cross-examining witnesses fairly, ensuring every procedural right his father was owed under the law was honored to the letter, refusing, publicly and privately, to minimize the harm done to Joel's victims in service of a lighter sentence. He did his job the way he did every job, exhaustively, honestly, without a single loose board in the structure of it. Joel pleaded guilty in the end, on Noah's chloride advice, to the full weight of what he had actually done, no plea bargain fiction, no minimized story. He stood in front of a federal judge and, for the first time in his adult life, told the complete truth about his own choices without a single word of self-defense woven into it. He was sentenced to 4 years, with the possibility of an earlier release for good behavior, and as the marshals led him from the courtroom, he looked back once, just once, and found Grace sitting in the 3rd row, not smiling, not gloating, just watching, with an expression that held both 20 years of hard-earned peace and something that might, in its own complicated way, have still been a kind of grace. Noah didn't visit his father in prison during that first year. He sent no letters, made no calls. Grace understood, without needing to ask, that her son was doing what he had always done, processing the world at his own pace, on his own terms, refusing to be rushed into a forgiveness he hadn't yet earned the right to feel for himself. She never pushed him toward Joel, and she never pushed him away from the possibility either. She had learned, over 3 decades of loving her son exactly as he was, that some things could not be hurried, and that patience was not the absence of hope but its quietest, most durable form. It was Eleanor's memorial service, held 18 months after Joel's sentencing, that finally moved something loose. Noah stood at the front of a small chapel and spoke about the woman who had found him on a stairwell landing with a deck of cards and refused to let the world's low expectations become his own. She used to tell me, and Noah said, his composed courtroom voice softened into something more private, that love isn't the finish line. It's the ground you stand on while you learn to run the race yourself. My mother gave me that ground first. Eleanor built the track. And I think, if either of them taught me anything about the lore I've spent my life practicing, it's that justice isn't about punishment for its own sake. It's about making sure the ground stays solid enough for the next person standing on it to have a fair chance. After the service, in the quiet of the chapel parking lot, Noah found himself thinking, unexpectedly, of his father, of a man sitting alone in a cell, having lost the empire he built on other people's trust, having lost, 20 years earlier, the chance to stand on solid ground with his own son simply because that ground required a kind of humility Joel hadn't yet possessed. Noah didn't decide, in that moment, to forgive him. Forgiveness, he'd come to understand through years of watching his mother navigate her own complicated grief, was not a single decision but a long, deliberate practice, when you sometimes had to choose again and again before it became true. But he did write his father a letter that night, not warm, not yet, but honest, which was the only currency Noah had ever really trusted. I'm not writing because I've forgiven you, he wrote. I'm writing because Eleanor Carter taught me that the ground someone stands on matters more than the mistakes that put them there, and I think, if you're willing to do the work, you might still build something worth standing on. I won't rush this. I won't pretend the last 20 years didn't happen. But I'll write again, if you write back honestly. That's the only offer I have. Joel wrote back the same week, and the letters that followed over the next 2.5 years were slow, careful, sometimes painful, occasionally, unexpectedly, funny in the particular way that only people who share old wounds can be funny with each other. Joel was released 14 months early for good behavior, with a restitution order that would take him the rest of his working life to satisfy, a debt he told Noah, in one of his last letters from prison, that he intended to honor completely, not because the law demanded it but because he finally understood what it meant to owe something and actually pay it. He did not move back into either of their lives in some tidy, sentimental homecoming. Grace never remarried him, never wanted to her. That door, she told Noah once, had closed cleanly and permanently the day she packed 2 suitcases in a 1-bedroom apartment above a laundromat, and she felt no grief about its staying shut. But she allowed Joel, eventually, carefully, on Noah's terms and her own, to sit at the edges of their lives, a birthday dinner here, an occasional Sunday phone call, a slow, humble, unglamorous rebuilding of a relationship that would never again resemble what it once pretended to be, and was, perhaps, more honest for exactly that reason. Grace watched her son build a life of quiet, formidable integrity, watched him marry a woman named Priya, the very occupational therapist's niece, as it happened, in one of those small, improbable circles the world sometimes draws, who understood him completely and loved him without needing him to be anyone other than who he actually was. She watched him argue cases before judges who respected him, mentor young attorneys who reminded her, in their nervous brilliance, of the boy who once lined up Lego bricks by color with total, joyful concentration. She watched him build, brick by careful brick, exactly the kind of solid ground Eleanor had once promised he could. And on the nights when Grace allowed herself to look all the way back, past the courtroom, past the letters, past the 1-bedroom apartment and the dinner shifts and the 2 suitcases in a Motel 6 parking lot, she understood, with a clarity that felt less like triumph and more like peace, that the greatest victory of her life had never really been about Noah becoming a respected attorney at all, though she was proud of that beyond words. The greatest victory was simpler, and harder one, and entirely his own. Her son had grown up in a world that had once tried to tell him he didn't fit its shape, and instead of shrinking to match its expectations, he had become a man who spent his life widening the shape for everyone who came after him. That, Grace thought, was the whole of it. Not revenge. Not even, fully, forgiveness, though there was some of that too, given slowly, on hard-earned terms. Just a mother's unconditional love, planted in a living room on a Tuesday afternoon 20 years before, that had grown, against every expectation the world had tried to place on it, into exactly the kind of solid, unshakable ground a person could build an entire life upon. If Grace and Noah's story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear that love without conditions is never wasted, even when it costs everything to give. And if you've ever had to choose between the easy path and the right one, tell us in the comments. We read every single word and would love to hear which part of Grace's story stayed with you longest.